Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome everyone to this installment of the STS 2022 webinar series. This series features presentations and panel discussions on a variety of topics relevant and important to cardiothoracic surgeons. The topic today is Annals Celebrates Peer Review Week, Research Integrity and Priorities. Please note, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the STS website and YouTube channel. We invite you to become a member of STS. You'll enjoy a variety of discounts, benefits, and opportunities to help you grow professionally. Learn more at sts.org/membership. At this time, I am pleased to welcome our moderator, Dr. Jo Chikwe. Dr. Chikwe, welcome. I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a genuine privilege to be joined by a really quite fantastic panel. We're going to be hearing from Tirone David, who's Senior Editor of Annals of Thoracic Surgery, as well as Professor of Surgery, the Melanie Monk Chair of Cardiovascular Surgery at the University of Toronto, and past President of ATS, and an awardee of the Order of Canada, Pedro del Nido, who is the William E. Ladd Professor of Child Surgery at Harvard Medical School, Chairman of the Department of Cardiac Surgery at Boston Children's Hospital, and a past President of the ATS. Valerie Rusch, who is Senior Editor of the Annals of Thoracic Surgery and at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where she's Vice Chair for Clinical Research and the Minor Family Chair in Interthoracic Cancers, and the past President of the American College of Surgeons. Elaine Tseng, who's a phenom and NIH-funded researcher, is the Science Editor of Annals of Thoracic Surgery. Suzanne Moffatt-Bruce is the CEO of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons for Canada. Mario Gaudino is the Senior Editor of Annals for Biostatistics and Research Methodology. He's at Weill Cornell in New York, where he's also Assistant Dean for Clinical Trials and the Professor of Cardiothoracic Surgery in the Division of Cardiac Surgery there. And then Robert Sade, who is Professor of Surgery at the University of South Carolina and Director of the Institute of Human Values in Healthcare. And what we're excited to do this afternoon is touch on some of what I think are the major questions in research and academic publication and presentation in our fields today, including what we see as the major unanswered questions and priorities for research in each of our fields, the barriers to conducting such research and how we could approach these challenges, both as individuals and as a specialty, how we can partner effectively with industry to perform impactful research and navigate the inevitable conflicts of interest, how our academic societies and journals can shape and support research, and what we as individuals can do to support research. John Entwistle from Thomas Jefferson University has very kindly stepped in to give Robert's talk, as Robert is indisposed. And this is going to be a really phenomenal overview of publication ethics that should set us up for a lively panel discussion. After which, we're going to hear from Suzanne Moffatt-Bruce on the role of research in patient safety, which should set us up for an equally lively discussion about research priorities. So I'm now going to hand off to Dr. Entwistle, who's going to speak to us about publication ethics.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chikwe. The theme of the Peer Review Week is research integrity, creating and supporting trust in research. Trust in part depends on perception of research ethics. So first, I'll briefly survey the ethical issues and then focus on two areas. One that is the most common form of author publication ethics violations, and the second honors the name of the week, the peer review process. The spectrum of publication ethics can be viewed in three levels of behavior. Misconduct that comprises transgressions that have a direct impact on the safety of patients by compromising the very foundations of science. And what Dr. Sade would refer to as disconduct, a lesser level of misconduct that harms the scientific enterprise in various ways. And then there's U-conduct, which describes how to do ethical research and report results in the right way. According to the federal guidelines from the Office of Research Integrity, misconduct comprises three elements: fabrication of data, falsification of research materials, processes, or data, and plagiarism of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving them appropriate credit. In our view, plagiarism does not undermine the foundations of science as profoundly as falsification and fabrication do, but rather it belongs in the category of disconduct, along with duplicate publications, so-called salami publication, non-disclosure of relevant competing or conflicts of interest, interpretation bias, and authorship, to name a few examples. U-conduct requires the author's absolute honesty and integrity, and in general, meticulously observes the principles of the responsible conduct of research, which include accountability for the highest level of ethical conduct, prevention of unethical conduct through the research process, observation of all standard scientific norms, and maintenance of a culture of integrity through the research project. For the next few moments, I will focus on the most common form of publication misconduct, and that is the qualification for authorship. That is, who can rightfully claim to be an author of a research paper. Most scientific medical journals subscribe to the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors requirements for authorship, as do all major cardiothoracic surgery journals. Anyone who submitted a paper to one of our journals as an author has checked all of the 4 required boxes. By checking the 4 items below, I attest that I am an author of this manuscript. Substantial contributions to the concept or design of the work, and drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual conduct, and final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. Note that all 4 criteria are required, but the most central requirement is the first one, because all contributors who meet that criterion can easily meet the other 3. Illicit authorship comes in 2 flavors: ghostwriting and honorary authorship. A ghostwriter is one who qualifies for authorship but is not named as an author, generally to conceal a conflict of interest that leads to undetected bias. The ghostwriter is often an industry representative who writes biased material to favor the company's product. The opposite flavor of illicit author is one who is named but doesn't meet the authorship criteria, often a senior member of the department who has been variously labeled honorary, courtesy, gift, guest, undeserving, or phantom author. At first impression, honorary authorship seems to not be a big problem. The more the merrier, correct? Yet it is a big problem. It is fundamentally dishonest, flouting the rules of scientific publication. Unjustified authors dilute the recognition of deserving scientists, and the guest author gains unwarranted praise for a high-quality paper. Padding the honorees' bibliography provides them with unfair, unearned advantage in the competition for reputation, promotion, and tenure. Giving the gift of authorship also games the peer review system by misusing the prestige of an undeserving senior author to gain a more favorable review. But more generally, the common knowledge that undeserved authorship is widespread undermines the overall trust and confidence in the meaning and significance of scientific authorship for those who actually do the work and deserve the credit. Unjustified authorship is exceedingly common, in the range of 60 to 70% of surgical publications. In one recent study, for example, 590 first authors in 5 cardiothoracic surgery journals responded to a survey focused on honorary authorship. 25% believed that honorary authorship was present in their own paper, but when presented with the specific ICMJE guidelines, fully 63% of the authors found that at least one author who did not meet the criteria. Here are the data on the 5 CT journals. The red bar is the self-perceived honorary authorship, and the dark bar is the guideline-based percentage. The Annals is at 63%, the European Journal is 62%, and JTCVS at 59%. Clearly, a variety of ethical issues infect authorship of scientific papers. So what can be done about it? At the front end, education of all research personnel in responsible conduct research could help, and such programs are available, often mandatory, at most research centers. For any of the disconducts, punitive action can be taken by the journal, most commonly in the form of sanctions that deny publication of the author's paper for a range of time, from 2 years to permanent prohibition, or by the author's institution, depending on the severity of the transgression. Seriously offending papers can be retracted from the literature, damaging the reputation of the authors, and in the worst case, of fabrication and falsification. Offenders can be and have been criminally prosecuted and sentenced to prison. Carrying out appropriate peer review is the responsibility of editors, the editorial board, and peer reviewers. Its purposes are to objectively evaluate the quality of science and potentially impact of the field. Most papers are not perfect on their first submission, so an important function of the reviewers is to provide constructive criticism aimed at improving the quality of the paper. The peer reviewer's proper function is to assess the paper's interest to readers, identify strengths and weaknesses, appraise the originality and the clarity of the text, tables, figures, judge the credibility and importance of the results, and provide detailed comments and suggestions for the authors. They must also address ethical issues such as scientific misconduct and disconduct. Peer reviews can be done poorly as well. Unhelpful reviews can be superficial or vacuous without substantive critique. Display ad hominem attacks on authors or institutions, be flawed by a variety of biases that idiosyncratically sabotage or support a study, or categorically reject negative studies. Worst of all is reviewer misconduct, violating the sanctity of confidentiality or appropriating information such as data or ideas for one's own use. Editors maintain the high quality of peer review in a number of ways, including, for example, rating the quality of reviews and providing feedback to reviewers and keeping a record of who provides the best reviews. On the most fundamental grounds, peer reviews and editorial boards and staff have a heavy responsibility keeping the scientific literature honest, clean, reliable, and meaningful. All in all, in that regard, they do an excellent job, and in do so, reinforce the basic requirement for success in the scientific enterprise, being apparently and actually worthy of trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Entwistle. We'll bring back the panel and really have a sort of thoughtful discussion about some of the issues that you've raised there. So you covered really quite a ton of ground. And I think maybe an interesting place to start is conflicts of interest. Almost before we came live, we were having a discussion about the value and the importance of industry in commercializing bright ideas and translating them into opportunities for delivering effective patient care. How do we navigate these conflicts that really are present now at almost every level in the clinical research that we are presenting?
I think it's very difficult to navigate that because right now a lot of people are they're checking off where they have conflicts, but we don't really know the severity of the conflicts and how much of a potential conflict is there. I think we need more transparency. We really do.
Mario, you've done some interesting work quantifying the impact of commercial conflicts of interest on the way research is conducted, reported, and disseminated. What thoughts do you have?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have done some work together, Joe, and I agree. It's not easy because just disclosing conflict of interest doesn't really tell a lot about the severity of the conflicts. In the ideal world, I think that industry should support clinical trial, but should not be allowed to run and analyze the clinical trial. So in an ideal world, there should be funding for industry to address a specific research question that is of interest to the company, but then the trial should be run and analyzed by someone else. Clearly that doesn't happen, but we have shown, and I mean, it's not a new information, that industry-sponsored trials tend to be, in the overwhelmingly majority of cases, positive for the industry-sponsored device of treatment. And this is something that has generally to do not so much with the way data are analyzed, but with the selection of the study population, of the outcome of the follow-up. Those are very important details of every trial that can spin the result of it. And if industry is left with freedom to select them, then clearly they will select those that are more likely to provide the result they want.
I think there's an interesting recent example that it's probably worth sharing. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine really this week and presented at TVT. So you have a really phenomenal 3,000 patient randomized trial that looked at patients with aortic stenosis undergoing TAVR here, randomized to cerebral embolic protection. And the primary endpoint, which was overall strokes, as you can see, was not significantly different between the two arms. There do appear to be maybe more disabling strokes in the control arm, but overall, the primary endpoint, there was really no difference. And yet the conclusion in the New England Journal of Medicine abstract and manuscript is among patients with aortic stenosis undergoing transfemoral TAVR, the use of cerebral embolic protection did not have significant effect on the incidence of periparesial stroke, but the results may not rule out a benefit. And that's a interesting example, I would say, of what maybe, Mario, you'd call spin.
Well, that's a by the book example of spin. The formal definition of spin is the focus on secondary result or trend, in this case, in the presence of a neutral primary analysis, to imply that the potential benefit may exist when this benefit is not supported by the data. I have read that paper, Joe, and I was struck by the fact that the NIJM editor allowed this to be in the conclusion section. It is true that the confidence interval is close to zero. The point that they are trying to make is that the confidence interval is mostly in the region of a possible effect, but you know, statistical significance is not reached. So you are 100% right. This is a perfect example of spin in what is unfortunately the most commonly read section of the whole manuscript, the conclusion of the abstract.
So what's interesting about that is I actually was at that meeting, and although I missed the presentation, I saw the slide deck afterwards and talk about spin rather than discussing what you just showed. They actually showed the difference in disabling stroke and made that a positive conclusion for the device, with a number needed to treat, I think, of like 125. So in fact, it wasn't even what you see as being sort of questionable. They were actually putting a positive spin on that by looking at sort of that subsection, despite such a large number needed to treat.
So given the importance of clinical trials in informing practice and driving our specialty forward, and given the challenges that many of us can speak to in terms of funding and supporting them, and actually how important it is to really obtain industry support, even if it's not in funding, it may be in securing the devices or the permissions or the pre-existing data to inform design. How do we navigate this? These trials are pivotal. These change treatment. How do we navigate this as a specialty? Do our societies have a role, Dr. Del Nido?
Joe, I think you know, the one critical role that societies play is providing guidelines, and the reason for that is that guidelines, by their very definition, are derived by a panel, typically an expert panel, and their responsibility is to review not just one paper, but to review many, many papers on the topic. And I think the positive that comes out of that is that, at least for that snapshot in time, in other words, literature changes, but the guidelines are written in a particular snapshot in time. In that time, then you at least have expertise addressing a question based on evidence. And I think that's what most practicing physicians base their decisions on. as opposed to a single journal having that much of an impact. You know, we can point to these factors, but I think it's also important to point out that every one of these clinical trials has a structure to it, which we never hear about. I'm sure there was a data safety management board that was part of that New England Journal publication and that trial. What prompted the data safety management board to say, yeah, there was evidence or there was no evidence? If stroke is a serious complication, the DSMB is supposed to look at those in a very critical way. And in fact, if they see a difference, they'll stop the trial, because it's unfair for, if they have enough evidence, it's unfair for the procedure or the therapy to continue if it has either an adverse effect or the opposite, if it has a substantially better effect than the control group. That information doesn't come out. You know, all of these trials have those protections. Are they perfect? No. But I think to give the impression that the editorial comments towards the end actually determine the message of the trial, all I can say is you know, that's why we rely on our societies to help us review all this information, because none of us have the time to do it.
And that's a great point, because it also underlines the importance of the peer review process in this. And as peer reviewers, we're often amateurs in this field. We're often not trialists. We're not methodological experts. And yet the onus is on us as peer reviewers to navigate the changes to conclusions, spin, potential conflicts of interest. How do the panel feel that the peer review process fares in this hugely important role? And perhaps that's a difficult question.
Well, Joe, I will say something that I think you are right, that there is no formal training to be a peer reviewer, and that's a problem, because then, I mean, you at some moment someone made the decision to assign you the responsibility of provide critical feedback on a paper, and you may not. You may be academic accomplished, but not ready for the task. And I'm sure, honestly, that my review 10 years ago were not as good as my review today. And probably, hopefully 10 years from now, my review will be better than today. So authors are paying a price for the process of me becoming a better reviewer. Probably yes. Unfortunately, this is the nature of the system. But there is something that journal can do, and actually the Annals has been doing it, and I thought it was really important. I think there are specific type of publication that require specific methodological knowledge, and the two extreme example that I can think of are meta-analysis and RCT. So I think for those type of publication, you need to have a reviewer that have specific knowledge and methodological experience, because you can be the best cardiac surgeon on earth, but maybe you don't know too much about meta-analysis or about RCT. And so I think it's important that for some type of publication, you don't just pick a general reviewer that maybe has done a lot of great review, but not on this particular type of study design.
That makes a lot of sense. I wanted to go back and hear your thoughts on honorary authorship, which authorship in general is clearly fraught with a lot of challenges. But I'd never really considered honorary authorship to be, although it's clearly not ideal, and it's not a great interpretation of the rules of authorship, as you outlined so well, Fletcher Whistle, never quite appreciated the potential for harm there. I'm curious, did you want to expand on some of those issues that you raised, and I'm curious to get the panel's opinion on that.
So I think that the biggest issue that I'm aware of, or at least in my mind, is that it makes evaluating somebody for promotion much more difficult. And it would be easier to gain promotion for somebody who may not have done the work to deserve it through honorary authorship. And by doing that, you are decreasing the incentive to do difficult work. You're decreasing the prestige of those who actually have done the work and have gotten the promotion through effort. I think it's more you're hurting your peers than you're hurting the science.
So is it your view that the senior author whose patients formed the body of the series, whose leadership has obtained the resources to do the research, but hasn't necessarily contributed to writing the paper, analyzing it in detail, or reviewing it, should just be acknowledged rather than an author?
Well, I mean, I think that every author, at a minimum, I mean, you can't have a paper that the authors have not reviewed, they have not agreed to. You know, if the senior author hasn't done that, they shouldn't be senior author. Now, it does become more difficult when you're talking about how much contribution did they make when they have contributed patients to it. Well, did they contribute patients and form the germ of the idea of the project? You know, how much of the project was their thoughts, their idea, and how much of it was just, okay, I have 100 patients who had this operation and they've walked away from it and somebody else is picking up the data and analyzing the data. I do think for the senior author, you need to have done more than just have supplied the patients. You need to have some brain power in there too.
Dr. David, how do you handle authorship at your institution?
In my CV, I don't subscribe to multiple authorship. I think if I did most work, I should be the senior author or the first author. And I do not believe to add surgeons as a co-author because they randomized 2 patients in 2 years or because they read and approved the paper. Unless they contributed the way the journals specify what a contribution is, I don't think should be a co-author. I have never been a co-author in one of my younger partners because I was division chief. I didn't think it was appropriate.
I think one other comment I would add, though, in that the reality as far as promotion is concerned, at least at my institution, really the only publications that are taken with any level of seriousness are the ones where you're either the first author or you're substantially demonstrated that your senior authorship was a major stimulus for the production of the paper, and you were a sponsor, in effect, of the activity. If you're in the middle somewhere, for promotions, at least in our institution, it's not even considered.
That's interesting that Pedro mentioned that, because at the University of Toronto, until precisely 10 years ago, in your CV, you list your papers and your role in each one of them. If you wrote by yourself, if you're a co-author, if you read, there are 5 classes. One is just, I think the lowest one was contributor. Could be anything like I enter 1 patient at trial. They stopped that for some reason. I thought it was very good before. Yeah. I don't know if you Harvard continue doing this.
Well, they're not that detailed, but I think the recognition is, I mean, is that this is this issue of honorary, I think is a good term, honorary authorship is so ubiquitous that if you're going to use authorship as a metric for accomplishments, it becomes very difficult, very challenging. And therefore the focus on whether there's evidence that you really were the primary driver of it in one form or another, and that usually means your position in the list of authorships.
I want to pivot from authorship to really what helps improve the quality of the papers that authors produce, which again is really sort of grounded in the peer review process. And I think Dr. Entwistle touched on some of the relevant aspects, but it's really worth, I think, underlining. Everybody here today is a really quite spectacular reviewer. As an editor, your sort of eyes light up when you get a review back in from Dr. David or Dr. Tseng or Dr. Gaudino, because you know that there's a real insightful, helpful, detailed feedback that the authors will value. And I think that that sort of constructive feedback is absolutely key. What we want to try and do is help the authors improve the article, even if it's not going to end up in the journal. It's really helpful to have a clear summary of the importance of the article. Just so one line is, why is this relevant? Why is it going to be impactful? Is it valid? Is it original? And then a couple of sentences that identify the major limitations. And those are often that it's underpowered, or that there's just selection bias that hasn't been adequately addressed, or it's a single institution experience that really isn't generalizable and doesn't help improve and move practice forward. But to also provide suggestions as to how these can be addressed or ameliorated. It's very helpful if the review is structured, perhaps starting with a one-sentence summary of the article, and that's helpful because it frames your thoughts as a reviewer. It can also help the editor that's reading your review. A one-sentence summary outlining those main strengths and limitations, and a list of 3 to 6 major issues, and then maybe a second list of minor issues, but that's not really necessary if the paper isn't going to get accepted. And one important thing to note that people often don't realize is there are 2 boxes. One, which is the box that you place your comments to the authors in, and that's the very detailed review. The confidential comments to the editors shouldn't be the same comments. The editors can see the comments to the authors. The comments to the editors are literally a one sentence saying, I am rejecting this article because I don't believe the data, or I don't think the conclusions are supported because, just a pithy one-liner, or I really recommend accepting this article after revisions because it's not been done before. It's the largest series. These guys are experts. We can really learn from it. That's incredibly valuable. And I'm interested to hear, for me, it probably takes a solid hour to thoroughly review a paper. It's a ton of work, maybe a couple of hours. If you follow the sort of advice and this phenomenal advice on how to write a great peer review by the then editor of JAC, Anthony DeMaria, which this is in 2003 in JAC, it's a significant amount of work. And I'm interested, how do we incentivize reviewers to review, to make that time commitment? Essentially, the reviewers that we're selecting for Annals often do 1 or 2 reviews a week. They'll have done 50 to 100 in a year. That's a huge amount of time. How do we recognize that? We try and raise the bar by recruiting the best reviewers to Annals, but what should we be doing beyond saying thank you to our reviewers? And
do you think reviewers should rewrite the paper for the authors? In other words,
that was my comment.
I don't think these are
That's not our job.
I think we should summarize our impression, the paper in 1 or 2 sentences, and then criticize only. If there's no criticism, accept the paper or ask for a minor revision. But to go sentence by sentence and try to rewrite somebody else's project, I not only time consuming, I don't know if it's appropriate.
I absolutely agree with you. There's a real temptation sometimes to try and rewrite, and you often see when a manuscript's gone through more than 1 or 2 cycles of review that that's what the editor and reviewers are trying to do, but it's not the right thing to do. Dr. Rusch.
Just to go back to a comment that was made earlier, I think that having some instruction or education to new reviewers to really set the framework and to have the guidelines for what the journal wants for peer review is worthwhile. And it's interesting that that doesn't happen routinely for most journals that I've been involved with. So I think that's it's very hard to find ways to give credit. It's similar to, I sit in our research council. I'm a co-chair of our research council, which is a committee that reviews all of the clinical Memorial Sloan Kettering. And trying to get good reviewers to read through each protocol is roughly 200 pages to read through and review protocols. And we send reports to department chairs on an annual basis to let them know how people are performing and try to get that incorporated into salary considerations. But it is very hard to get adequate credit for this kind of work.
Dr. Moffatt-Bruce.
I was just going to add that at least in Canada, we have 3 levels of CME credits, and the third, the self-assessment and peer review, are the most difficult to get. And so we've really pivoted to take these type of peer review, particularly for journals, to be credit to our part 3. And that has seemed to have been perceived very well, because it's not only that they can review someone else's, but they're learning whilst they're doing it. So, and they can claim several credits. So that seems to have been received well, at least here in Canada. And I think it does matter, right? Because you're getting recognition for all the review process that you put into it, which can be very timely, Joe, to your point.
Dr. Tseng.
I just wanted to make a brief comment about when we are educating new reviewers. This particularly is more relevant in sort of the scientific investigations and less so for like the clinical reviews. But a lot of times in science, the data is what the data is, and you're presenting all of the data and trying to make the best interpretation in your analyses. But sometimes the reviewers have a bias of what the data is supposed to look like. And when your data doesn't show that, it doesn't mean it shouldn't get published. It means that's what the science shows. And if anything, it's what you need to study. So I think that's an actual really important point that I would love for especially the junior reviewers to understand, is that your inherent biases that you may carry of what you think your results should be, or someone else's results should be, may not be the science. And in fact, this kind of goes back to what Dr. Del Nido mentioned earlier about guidelines. I mean, I think some of the interesting things I find about the way guidelines are developed is that sometimes people really do have these natural biases about what their expert opinions are on various things. But when you actually go through the literature and you pull it all together, that may not be what it was based on, incomplete knowledge from expert opinion before. But now that you are collecting data and have multi-institutional data from other places with different populations, aneurysm growth rates or aneurysm dissection as examples are not what we used to think they are. And so then risk-benefit ratios may actually change based upon more recent data. So I think it's important to be as unbiased as possible and open-minded to looking at the data as it is without those kind of preconceived notions of what it should be.
And Dr. Entwistle, you did highlight that in your talk, the sort of importance of trying to maintain that open-minded approach as a peer reviewer.
Yeah, absolutely. So the one comment I want to make, this goes back to the comments made earlier about rewriting somebody's paper that's been submitted that you're reviewing. I think there's a role for that. And it's one thing that I guess I tend to do in my reviews. If I see a paper that is good science and it is a good paper, but it's not written that well, I would hate for it to be published in that form, because I think that reflects poorly on the journal. It looks like the journal is written by people who are not as diligent as I would like them to be. And I think that sometimes people are really great at science and maybe not great at writing, and they need the help and the education to get them there.
But you know, all the journals, the cardiac journals, had an English editor and an expert in writing papers when I started practicing 40 years ago. I never forgot my very first paper. One was printed entirely different than what I wrote. Same message, but they thought was worthwhile. English being my second language, what an awful author.
I wish we could afford a resident English language writer, because it's incredibly time consuming and it's so,
yes,
yeah, it really does add value. I think let's now pivot to sort of a key part. This is all geared towards improving our patient outcomes and what we do. Dr. Moffatt-Bruce is going to speak very specifically now sort of on this topic, and really focus for a little while on patient safety and the role of research. So let me pull up the slides and hopefully move through to, there we go.
Great, thanks very much. And maybe just over the next couple of minutes, I'll just share with you that there are many forms of research, and all that we do almost every day to improve outcomes can actually be scholarly. It can advance our patients' outcomes and also, advance us academically. So it's not as simple as a checklist, but it has to start with the checklist. When you embrace patient safety and really making it into an academic and learning cycle, you have to have good processes in place. And one of my colleagues, one of my co-researchers for many years used to say, you can't research bad processes. So when you want to create a portfolio of research around patient safety, you really have to kind of get it right first before you start researching it and iterating. So the experience that I'll share tonight in the next few minutes is that of my previous experience at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And we had an imperative, like we wanted to do better. We wanted to have better outcomes. There were some mandates in that there was value-based care and payment reform coming down the pipeline, but also we had public reporting. And so if your results and your patient safety is being shared publicly, you want to own it, and you want to make sure that it looks pretty good so that your patients are really reaping the benefits of those interventions. And at the same time, we were very much invested in learning about this idea of a learning health system, and that so that every patient engagement, every patient interaction we could learn from. And this has stuck with me for many years, that every time we intervene and improve patient safety, we should learn from every patient. But that takes discipline, and that's where the research comes in. So our research was really founded around, the voice of the patient. And we always felt that if the patient, in this instance, Mrs. Post, brought issues to us that they thought were important, they were probably worthy for publication, because there was a need, and there needed to improve our dissemination of what we were doing to improve patient safety. We leveraged almost everything we did in patient safety, whether or not it was a falls wheel to prevent falls, or using the EMR to improve clinical guidelines. We very much just used it and published it with some discipline. These papers, as Joe will show here, were not in the New England Journal of Medicine. They were in lesser profiled journals, but still they mattered, and they got the message out of how we were improving outcomes. We then expanded our focus, and so that even big system-wide projects like clinical alarms became a research endeavor every time we were improving the outcomes. Even if it wasn't that we didn't get it right in the first instance, that was worthy of publication as well. And we used that discipline for research to kind of hardwire some of the processes that we were improving upon in patient safety. Again, we published, and as we became more adept to translating our patient safety message into research, the journals became a higher profile, and we were certainly able to then impact more broadly, both nationally and internationally. And ultimately, this became part of our transformation to a learning health system, so that every time we were implementing change, we were measuring it, we were publishing on it, and then we were iterating to improve and to make those changes, those patient safety engagement strategies, sustainable. Ultimately, we were able to put all of these patient safety initiatives into a grant. At that time in 2016, it was still in paper, and herein is a 642-page submission that had to be copied 10 times and sent to AHRQ. And I'll remember it, to this day, when we were successfully brought together 23 investigators to submit this publication, or to submit this grant. And ultimately, we were funded for a P30 grant, and we're one of 11 patient safety learning laboratories in North America. Ours was called the Institute for the Design of Environments Aligned for Patient Safety. And so it really became inherent to everything we did, was that we would identify issues, implement change processes, and then study them and disseminate them through the research. Ultimately, our patient safety laboratory, that was 5 years in the existence, published over 60 articles and resulted in lots of great changes. As you can see here, we implemented changes relative to clinical alarms. We were able to leverage our 23 investigators and actually do digital hotspotting, so we could predict within the hospital where infections might occur based on historical EMR data. And then even leverage the EMR and what we had learned in crew resource management to take data and transform it into patient-facing information, and truly was transformative relative to the engagement of our patients, our patient safety initiatives, and then the overall learning health system. And so ultimately, the Institute for the Design of Environments Aligned for Patient Safety, Ideas for Patient Safety, was able to leverage alarms. We're able to improve on digital hotspotting and preventing infections, and then ultimately also use these feedback loops to improve the patient experience. And I'm really proud that these changes that we made then became operationalized and became inherent to the DNA of the organization, so that they lived on through the changes that we had implemented, all under the auspice of patient safety and research. So going forward, and how this could become even more practical, is that every day we have these opportunities to learn from these changes that we make. We can implement them into our own practice improvement, and ultimately that turns into a learning cycle that can be either individual, faculty or division led, or institutional led, because these learning cycles are inherent to how we elevate and leverage research around everything we do to improve patient safety. So what I present here is really when it all comes together, when you bring the science, the implementation science, when you bring informatics and wanting to do things differently and better, and when that aligns, you can deliver so much excellent knowledge, improved outcomes, and dissemination of great practices that will impact other patients locally, regionally, and internationally. So Joe, with that, I thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and truly happy to take any questions whatsoever.
Thank you very much. It's probably the ultimate sort of aspect of research that we do, is to try and improve our patient outcomes. And we always think of the research as a sort of pyramid, all the way from sort of basic science to that kind of very, very clinical. And so I'm interested to hear from the panel what they feel are the real priorities, from basic translational mechanistic all the way up through clinical trials, and then sort of safety, healthcare disparities. What are the priorities for research in each of your fields? What papers do you want to see? What presentations on the plenary sessions do you want to see in the next 2 or 3 years? What are you working on? Maybe we'll start with thoracic, Dr. Rusch.
Well, I'm specifically involved in thoracic oncology, so it's yet a more focused area. It's not all of general thoracic, obviously. We're in the midst of a revolutionary period in terms of oncology care due to genomics and also a constant stream of new therapeutics. And what's often not considered within the context of testing new therapeutics in thoracic oncology is the surgical end of the treatment and the details of surgical care. And I think this is incredibly important. This explosion in terms of understanding tumor biology and having lots of novel treatment strategies available is also happening simultaneously with an evolution in delivery of surgical care with newer approaches to how we do resections, usually more minimally invasive. And there's relatively little information sort of looking at that aspect of some of the major clinical trials that we're doing. So I think in thoracic oncology, looking at the role of different surgical techniques and how it affects outcomes in the context of this tremendous evolution that's going on in the treatment of malignancies is very important. And hard to get any funding for that aspect of clinical trials. For those of us who are involved in this area, you sort of have to sneak it into the trial design so that you really have sound data to analyze at the conclusion of the trial.
Dr. Del Nido.
In the congenital field, probably one of the most exciting things that's been going on is the real focus on the long-term outcome of patients, looking at the life cycle. In the past, the focus had been entirely, at least the surgical publications, on operative mortality, survival of the surgery, 1 or 2 year survival. For most of our patients who are, young infants, yes, those are important, but we've gotten very good at getting children to survive their operations and their early years, but we're not very good at managing their late complications. And that's what the field is really focusing on now, both from the standpoint of decisions that are made very early in their life, which send the children down one pathway versus another. I guess probably the area that we've been interested the most has been single ventricle disease. In other words, where functionally children are born with only one ventricle, and they're taking down a pathway where they're physiologically only have one pumping chamber. This, as we are now recognizing, although it's a relatively straightforward procedure, technical procedure, the consequences of that late are enormous. So we're looking at it again. We're saying, well, what can we do about it? Can we change the course of natural history? And I think there's very, very good evidence from many centers coming out now saying that, yes, we can change it, whether it's in utero interventions, balloon valvotomy in a fetus now is a relatively standard procedure. Whereas 10 years ago, it was totally experimental. So it's a rapidly evolving field. The other area that I think is exciting is in cell-based therapy. And that is the idea that these ventricles have been subjected to very abnormal loading conditions literally for decades. Single ventricle supporting 2 circulations is by definition doing more work than normal. And therefore the risk that it'll fail is far greater. Cell-based therapy now is being looked at. So whether it's stem cells and which type of stem cells, or even portions of cells, and what their impact could be. And the early clinical trials, unlike the adult stem cell trials, in children, for whatever reason, it seems like there is some real benefit. So that's actually quite exciting. And whether it's because of they're younger, their physiology is different, whether the cells that they're using, which are handled differently, we're still learning. We're still learning that, but it's I think it affords hope for these kids who are now adults for a better future.
Dr. Moffatt-Bruce.
Just to share some of the research that we're being asked to do now at a national level because of the crisis that we're facing in healthcare after COVID and with all our HHR issues. One is, how do we train, and in particular surgeons, in a new era where we may not have as much exposure, virtual reality, simulation. And so we're being asked to do that research so that we can further bring on more people in this arenas to take care of patients, particularly in surgery. The second piece of research that we're being asked to complete in a very interprofessional way is how to retain surgeons and specialists in the arena of healthcare and remain well. So what actions are being taken to actually improve the wellness of our providers, and how does it impact the long-term outcome on our patients? So we're seeing that we're now being asked to do that research. And I think that gives us some hope that there really is investment in our profession as a whole so that we can ultimately improve outcomes for our patients.
Dr. Tseng.
Well, some of my research really falls into aneurysm biomechanics. And from that perspective, I would say that it turns out that there's a lot less evidence than we realized in the field in terms of who really is at risk of dissection or rupture or growth, and in a way trying to develop better markers for all of these things, because essentially using everything that we have from clinical data, whether it's diameter or various indices, we really haven't made a mark on really reducing aneurysm complications. And so from that perspective, sort of developing a personalized risk stratification for these types of things, because we're finding out that there are more people that have it than ever. We're getting so many more incidental CTs, and yet not everyone's going to have that complication. So really being able to kind of personalize that risk strategy is something that we're interested in. But honestly, I think one of the bigger issues really to touch upon is even what you're doing, Joe, in terms of CTSN. I think that's a really valuable resource for performing the types of clinical trials that surgeons need to be involved in to really answer questions that we had intrinsic biases about, right? We did for ischemic MR, and look at what happened with that trial. And we really sort of need more funding in those kinds of areas, because when it comes to doing it through NIH, you have less of the bias, right? You're not going to have the industry bias. So ways to kind of involve science in such a way that, I mean, I completely agreed with Mario that, you know, ideally, even if industry funded it, it should, the primary outcome and the secondary outcomes should all be picked by sort of independent people, so it doesn't bias it one way or the other from sort of interventional versus surgery. So some of those types of things are really critical.
Dr. David.
Interesting. Someday last week, I got an email from a first-year trainee in cardiac surgery from Switzerland, and she said that she was very discouraged. She started in July, and by the end of September, every single mentor told her, why in the hell you chose cardiac surgery? There's nothing else to be done in cardiac surgery. The cardiologist is taking over. So I didn't reply until Sunday when I had more time to read her email. And I thank her for relying on me. I don't know who the girl is, never seen or heard of her name. And I said, when I start my practice, my mentor told me to focus in one area to be able to change the area. Otherwise, the culture is so broad, so complicated that it's impossible to have an impact. So I chose heart valve disease, or he chose for me. And I thought that after 45 years dedicating my life to the study of heart valve disease, very little has changed. And I'm not exaggerating. Yeah, we have TAVI now, didn't have before. But everything is suboptimal. Everything is a miserable palliation. We don't have a tissue that can replace parts of the heart or a heart valve. After 70 years dedicated to this, we doctors do not have a proper patch yet. I told this to the girl, of course. We don't have a perfect heart valve. We don't have a perfect operation for numerous pathologies. And the list goes on. And of course, I spent my lifetime looking at longitudinal outcomes, and you'll be reading more and more 20 and 30-year results of heart surgery. But I think the whole area is that to be explored yet. And you should encourage younger people to go back to the basics and rewrite the books from ABC all the way to the end.
Dr. Gaudino, I'll give you the last word. We have a minute.
Well, I will be quick, Joe. In adult cardiac, I think we should just stop wasting time, money, and resources in comparative observational study that no matter how you adjust are intrinsically biased, because what we learn from the first day of surgical training is that we do different operation in different patients. And so, and try to do more randomized trials so that questions that have been open for decades, like the use of multiple arterial grafting, minimally invasive procedure, can finally be solved by properly designed and powered randomized trials.
I think that's incredibly well said. I think academic societies have a huge opportunity, role, and responsibility in supporting that. And with the last remaining seconds of time, I'm going to thank the panel for, I think, raising fundamentally important issues in research, and encourage everybody to come to the STS in January, where hopefully some of this high impact specialty transforming research will be presented. Thank you all very, very much indeed. This webcast will be available on demand at the STS website. Thank you.